Movies, like any other form of media, can be very influential. This influence can be something complex, like what the Lord of the Rings trilogy showed us was possible in the film medium and the fantasy genre. Or it can be something simple, like hurting shower curtain sales, which was the case with Psycho. But what about the negative influences in film? Yes, shower curtain sales still haven't fully recovered, but in this video, we're looking for the films with the worst influence. We found 14 films worth discussing and grouped them into 3 categories. The worst influences on what films are made, on how films are made, and influences that go beyond the film industry. These will be films that single-handedly popularized questionable subgenres, or really made studio execs greedy, or even gave people an irrational phobia decades after their release. This video will be packed with many contenders, but we want to hear from you. Which film do you think deserves to take the crown for having the worst influence? Now, we aren't saying that all films in this video are terrible. In fact, most of them are very good. It's their influence that we aren't very fond of. We'll start with films that gave a certain genre a boost, only for terrible films of that genre to flood the industry in the following years. And what better example of this than Scary Movie? Released in the year 2000 on only a $19 million budget, the film grossed $278 million. It not only kickstarted a successful series, but gave the spoof and parody genre a resurgence. The genre already saw success many years before with movies like Airplane and Naked Gun, but it was Scary Movie that brought it into the mainstream again, and not in an enjoyable way. The films influenced over the next decade by the Scary Movie series ended up being some of the worst films ever made. Date Movie, Epic Movie, Meet the Spartans, Superhero Movie, and Disaster Movie. It even leaked into the following decade with Vampires Suck, Movie 43, and The Starving Games. And almost all of these films can be attributed to 2 names, Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer, who wrote and directed most of them, reversing everything Scary Movie did for the genre. The Blair Witch Project, Saw, and 2003's Texas Chainsaw Massacre each played a part in sending the horror genre into the dark age. Released in 1999, The Blair Witch Project grossed $248 million on a measly $750,000 budget, and it became the pioneer of the found footage horror genre. And although we had some great found footage films, even extending outside of horror with films like Chronicle, a lot more garbage came along with it. Found footage was cheap and allowed for anyone to make these kinds of films as long as you had a camera and an idea. We obviously encouraged this kind of filmmaking, but what it spawned instead were many poorly written, slow-paced, copy and pasted plots with a shaky, nauseating camera. Every genre has made terrible, low-effort films, but with found footage, you really need to dig deep to find the gems. Saw, on the other hand, was a misunderstood hit that unintentionally spawned the torture horror genre. Released in 2004 on a $1.4 million budget and a $103 million box office, studios saw it as another type of profitable film to churn out for cheap. The original wasn't even too gory itself. It was a well thought out horror film building up to a single gory moment. But studios saw its gore as the reason why it was so successful and really pushed it, dropping its quality of characters and writing for more gory spectacles. Most of the Saw films still did well at the box office, but unlike the originals, people's opinion of them fell. And the films inspired by the series were just as bad or even worse. Captivity, Train, Grotesque, the Hostel sequels, and Human Centipede, just to name a few. And then we have 2003's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which influenced many classic horror remakes and franchises to be revived. Earning $107 million on a lowly $9.5 million budget, the greedy and lazy caught wind of its success, and soon every old horror film was remade during the 2000s and 2010s. The Wicker Man, The Omen, Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the list goes on. And just like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all of these films had terrible reviews. It was a very confusing time for fans of the originals. The horror genre was now at a low point due to these 3 films, and it would take a while for it to recover. In the same spirit as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, our next contender is the 2010 Alice in Wonderland remake. Grossing over $1 billion worldwide and winning 2 Oscars, Alice in Wonderland's success started a live-action fairy tale trend. The films that came from this trend were not so great, leaving only Disney to continue this trend, transforming it into the Disney live-action remake trend. Now, Disney has done some live-action remakes in the past, but Alice in Wonderland really started this movement to milk their old IPs. During a time when this risk-averse industry was already flooded with superhero films, we had one of the biggest players using their resources into remaking their old films. These remakes are what people point to as the best example of Hollywood's issue with originality right now, and it all stems from the success of Alice in Wonderland. Most of these films are bringing in big box office numbers, so Disney will continue to make them. And although most of them aren't terrible films, the way way they harm the film industry makes Alice in Wonderland a major contender for the worst influence. You can ignore other genres temporarily being flooded with bad films, but these Disney remakes encourage unoriginality. It makes you wonder what kind of great movies we've been robbed of with the money that's being spent on these films whose budgets are shockingly high. With The Little Mermaid not doing well, maybe we'll see Disney start to rethink this strategy and invest in more original content. There's a lot of ground to cover in this section, with many of the film's influences being related to each other except for one. So we're going to start with the odd one out, and that is Bourne Supremacy and Ultimatum and their influence on the use of shaky cam and quick cuts during action scenes. Before these movies, action scenes were usually filmed with more static camera positions or locked-in movements. Along came the Bourne Trilogy, where Paul Greengrass made the action sequence a lot more grounded and gritty, with the shaky cam and quick cuts immersing the audience in the stress the character was feeling during that situation. The film's influence over this more grounded form of action was actually good, where we saw Daniel Craig's James Bond continue this trend. But the increase in using shaky cam and quick cuts was not so great because people were using it wrong. Movies started using this style of filmmaking to obscure action rather than enhancing it, hiding poor choreography and stunt doubles. The end product ended up being a nauseating, hard to follow experience, as we saw in the Taken sequels, Hunger Games, and most cheaper action films.
Step back, I think I'm gonna vomit!
Some people are still split whether the shaky cam was good in the Bourne Trilogy, but the difference between those films and the ones it influenced was that the action is well choreographed and they use the techniques outside of action scenes. Paul Greengrass remains the best user of this technique, but there's no forgetting the headaches we had to suffer watching the films that tried to follow in his footsteps. This next film's influence is both very positive and negative, and that's Jaws. Released in 1975, Jaws is considered the first blockbuster, practically inventing the term. It established just how important wide releases were with heavy television marketing. Films used to have more progressive releases, slowly entering markets and gaining support over time as positive reviews and word of mouth spread. Jaws showed us that there was a lot of potential for quick profits in film, completely changing film marketing and what a Hollywood hit really meant. The industry business model was all about high concept films with premises that could be easily described and marketed. And so many great films soon followed it, ushering in the 80s, also known as the blockbuster decade. So what's so negative about this? Well, it helped end the new Hollywood era in favor of safer, profitable, big-budget films. Auteur films and filmmakers were disregarded, and those that would meet studio demands were favored. Films weren't being made to be artistic, but to make money. Rather than letting a movie become a blockbuster naturally, Hollywood would engineer them to become one. And this engineering meant prioritizing simplistic storytelling and special effects, trying to reach 4-quadrant appeal. We are now really in the thick of it with this low-risk, safe-profit filmmaking, but it all came from Jaws and its partner in crime, Star Wars, who took things to another level with merchandising. Star Wars really revolutionized merchandising in film, really making it a viable way to earn money instead of just an afterthought. Merchandising is fine, but it influenced some very greedy studio execs that made parts of films or even entire films solely for the purpose of merchandising. Entire toy and collectible lines were thought out before a film's script was even finished. It's actually crazy how much some films make from this. Cars only made $462 million at the box office, but made $10 billion in merchandise sales by 2011. So it's hard to blame studios for having merch on their minds with some of their bigger films. These next 4 films with the worst influence follow in the same vein as Jaws and Star Wars: money. First up, 1992's Aladdin. While it was a great film overall, what stood out the most was Robin Williams' legendary performance as the genie. The performance was praised, but having a famous actor as a voice actor really helped in generating hype for the film. This led to the celebrification of later animated films, getting star-studded casts that really helped in the film's marketing. The problem was that these actors usually had zero voice acting experience, and it showed. Veteran voice actors were sidelined for their less talented but more famous counterparts. We've now had a few decades of this. Decades full of mediocre performances, all culminating in the Super Mario Bros. Cast whose performances were mostly bland. 2009's Avatar released with revolutionary CGI and 3D, becoming the highest grossing film of all time, and it was all helped by the fact that 3D tickets were more expensive. Many studios saw the success 3D had, but more so the higher ticket cost, and decided, hey, let's make every film 3D. The difference was that Avatar was designed for 3D, whereas almost every film that was getting 3D releases in the following years was not. There have been many 3D eras in the past, but the one that followed Avatar was by far the laziest, leaving 3D as a post-production gimmick rather than anything that enhances the actual experience. There were still some 3D gems, but for the most part, we saw ourselves trying to find non-3D screenings of films. Not to save a few bucks, but to actually improve the experience by not having to wear those glasses that provided almost no benefit. But who knows if this trend will be back after Avatar: The Way of Water's success. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 also kicked off a greedy trend back in 2011, with this unnecessary splitting of books into multiple films. In the case of Harry Potter, splitting the final book into 2 separate films actually made sense because the book had 2 arcs: the journey for the Horcruxes and the finale. And with Hollywood being Hollywood, they started to take the same approach, but with double dipping into profits in mind. Twilight and The Hunger Games both split their final books into 2 films, making the first part of these films very slow, uneventful, and solely a build-up. Denis Villeneuve also split up Dune into 2 parts, which was a good idea with how eventful the book is, but it does leave the first film with a lackluster ending. But I think the Hobbit trilogy was the most infamous for this, somehow splitting a less than 400-page book into 3 beefy films with even beefier extended editions. And the thing is that the films did well at the box office just like all of the other segmented films, only encouraging Hollywood to continue this practice if given the chance. And the final film with the worst influence on how films are made was The Avengers. The Avengers found enormous success at the box office back in 2012, which culminated from years of film releases building up to it, starting with Iron Man. Its success reassured how viable the MCU will be, leading to every studio trying to get in on the cinematic universe gold rush. The problem was that where the MCU spent multiple years building up each character, taking years before seeing the ensemble together for the first time, others just rushed in instead. The DC Extended Universe really rushed in, where by the second film you had Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman all together while we've only seen Superman in a standalone film prior to this. We just weren't attached to these characters the same way we were with the MCU. Cinematic universes can be done very well, allowing the same lore to be explored over multiple films. But when they start forcing everything into a cinematic universe, or when they have a cinematic universe planned way before a film is released, it starts getting very annoying. Just like the Dark Universe with its Witness the Beginning tweet to generate hype, only for it to flop after just 1 film. Oftentimes, a film's influence can extend past the film industry. This influence can be something personal, like finding a passion for something you never knew you had, or something more grand, like the creation of several fight clubs across the United States. And there were 3 films that really stuck out in this category. The first one being Top Gun. Released in 1986, the film was perceived by some as pro-war propaganda, especially with how involved the military was with the movie. With so many films being released criticizing the military really needed a boost and found themselves a glorified recruitment video in the form of Top Gun. At its release, many theaters had Navy recruitment booths set up, and the number of young men wanting to be naval aviators increased by 500%. The film's negative influence was that it glorified the pilots as womanizers and heavy drinkers, so the new recruits signed up with that mentality. This led to the tailhook scandal in 1991, where 83 women and 7 men were SA'd by aviation officers at their annual convention in Las Vegas. These tailhook conventions used to be pretty tame, but got more and more rowdy each year after Top Gun released, culminating in the 1991 incident. The scandal was very public, and the military dropped support for any possible sequels. We actually have a video that goes into more detail about this if you want to check it out after this one. This next film is one of the most controversial films out there and probably the worst influence outside of the medium, and that's The Birth of a Nation. Released in 1915, it is one of the most racist films, being the main reason the KKK was reborn later that year. The film treats African Americans as villains and portrays the Klansmen as valiant saviors. It was a catalyst for race riots, fights against African Americans, and even lynchings. It is a disgustingly vile film that brainwashed a lot of people back then. It would honestly be better forgotten, except that it really innovated the film medium, with director D.W. Griffith introducing dramatic close-ups and tracking shots, as well as parallel action sequences, cross-cutting, and other editing techniques. The film is still discussed and respected to this day, but only from a technical standpoint. And our final film with the worst influence is Jaws. Yeah, that's right, we're double dipping Hollywood style. Unlike its influence on inventing the blockbuster, which was bittersweet, there's nothing good that came out of giving everyone a fear of sharks. Beach attendance dropped in 1975 and reported shark sightings increased. It was called the Jaws effect, not only instilling the fear of sharks, but it made people believe that sharks were villains and monsters like in the movie. Sharks actually only account for about 10 human deaths a year, whereas falling coconuts kill 150 humans every year. But after the film's release, tournaments and shark fishing trips were happening across the US as a way to slaughter them. Peter Benchley, the author of the book Jaws is based on, campaigned to stop the depopulation of sharks and reiterated that Jaws was fiction. Spielberg also echoed this, regretting this action against sharks because of the film and book. And just like most of the films we mentioned in this video, its influence was an unintentional byproduct of its success. Most of these films did things so well that the industry was flooded with cheap, greedy attempts at mimicking them. Other films had people misunderstanding them or focusing on the wrong parts, except for Birth of a Nation. Its terrible influence was very intentional. And there you have it. That was a lot. 14 films that we thought had the worst influence grouped into 3 categories. We definitely missed some, so we want to hear from you what other films you think had the worst influence either on the film industry or outside of film. Leave your comments down below. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and make sure to check out our Patreon for more content and some cool perks. So until next time, have a good one.